Marcus had never been lucky with women. For years, he watched his friends effortlessly find companionship, while he struggled through awkward conversations and timid flirtations that went nowhere. He wasn't unattractive, average looks, decent job, a little charisma when he managed to shake off his nerves, but something always seemed to get in the way. Maybe it was his desperation, the way he craved their attention, how he fixated on any glimmer of interest. He could never quite strike the right balance, and so he remained alone. That all changed the night he met her. It was at the Scarlet Room, one of the most popular nightclubs in Dredford. He had never set foot in a place like this. The red lights cast glamorous shadows over the red velvet in the furniture. The lounge music sent relaxing frequencies to the mind. Beautiful people populated every seat in the house. He felt out of place, awkward in his plain clothes. Yet something had drawn him there that night, as if some unseen force guided his steps. And then he saw her. She stood at the bar, illuminated by a soft red glow, her pale skin almost ethereal against the dark backdrop of the lounge. Her hair cascaded in waves of black silk, framing a face that was both hauntingly beautiful and unsettlingly perfect. Her eyes, deep and blue, locked onto his the moment he noticed her, and in that instant, everything else faded into the background. She was like no one he had ever seen, and he couldn't take his eyes off her. His heart raced as she smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of her lips that sent a shiver down his spine. Before he could muster the courage to approach, she was already moving toward him, her gaze never wavering. She greeted him almost in a whisper when she was close enough for him to hear over the music. Her voice was delicate, sending tingles in his head, with an edge of something dangerous beneath it. Marcus was caught off guard, his usual nervousness kicking in, but the way she looked at him, as though he were the only one in the room, melted away his hesitations.
I'm Marcus.
He stammered, feeling foolish as soon as the words left his mouth.
I know. I've been watching you.
She said, smiling again. Her words sent his mind spinning. She had noticed him? Of all the people in this crowded club, this stunning woman had singled him out. It felt impossible, yet there she was, inches away from him, her presence overwhelming, intoxicating. She leaned in closer, the scent of her perfume wrapping around him like a warm fog.
Let's get out of here,
she murmured, her lips brushing his ear. And just like that, he followed her out of the club, driven by an infatuation that drowned out all reason. The nights that followed were a blur of ecstasy and confusion. She seduced him over and over again, each time more intense, more primal. Her name was Vanessa Cross, and he became consumed by her, lost in the allure of her beauty, her mystery. They would meet in the darkest corners of the city, her body always pressed close to his, her lips at his neck. Every encounter left him feeling drained, both physically and emotionally. Yet he couldn't resist her. The more she took from him, the more he craved her touch. His thoughts were consumed by her, her face, her voice, her scent. He found himself cancelling plans with friends, neglecting work, skipping meals, all for the chance to see her again. But there was something else. A darkness lingered beneath her beauty, something he couldn't quite put into words. When she kissed him, there was always a flash of pain, a sharp bite that sent waves of pleasure and discomfort through him. He never asked about it, he couldn't. It was as if his mind refused to question what was happening, as though he were under some spell, his will bending to hers without his consent. As the days passed, Marcus grew pale and weak. His co-workers commented on how sickly he looked, how distant he had become. He barely ate, barely slept, and yet every time Vanessa called, he rushed to her side. He couldn't say no. She was everything he had ever wanted, and yet he felt himself slipping further into a fog, unable to think clearly, unable to break free. The night it all unraveled was like any other. They met again at the Scarlet Room, the heart of the glamour in Dredford's nightlife, just as they had the first time. But tonight, there was a hunger in Vanessa's eyes, something more urgent, more dangerous. She led him to a private room of the club, away from prying eyes, the mellow bass masking the sound of their whispered exchanges. When her lips found his neck again, the pain was sharper this time. He winced, trying to pull away, but she held him tighter, her fingers digging into his arms with unnatural strength. Something was wrong. The fog that had clouded his mind for so long was lifting, and suddenly he felt the cold edge of fear slice through him.
Vanessa, please stop.
But she didn't stop. Her grip tightened, her body pressing harder against his as she drank deeper, the heat of her breath scorching his skin. He struggled, panic rising in his chest as the world around him started to blur. His vision dimmed, the edges of his consciousness slipping away as she consumed him. And then in a flash of horror he understood. She wasn't just taking from him, she was devouring his life. In his final moments, Marcus saw her for what she truly was. Not a woman, but a predator. Her eyes gleamed with unnatural hunger. As his body went limp in her arms, she pulled away, blood staining her lips, her face a mask of dark regret. Crimson tears stroked her eyes as she used the intercom to call for help. This never happened before. She never killed someone while feeding. She was always careful, but tonight, something had awoken inside her. Something ancient, something powerful and draconic. After a moment, the owner of the place entered the room with her master key, Yelena Andreeva. She quickly took control of the situation and asked for the familiars to take care of the indiscretion. The owner did not seem pleased as she took Vanessa into another room to wait while it was all sorted out. Vanessa saw herself in the mirror, and the visage that looked back at her was the same she saw in Marcus' eyes. She was no longer human, and there was nothing she could do about it. The moon hung low over the jagged silhouette of the forest, its pale light barely piercing the thick canopy of trees. The forest was ancient, breathing with a threatening stillness that seemed to crouch in wait. Somewhere in the dark, branches snapped. Footsteps, quick and urgent, thudded against the cold earth. A man tore through the underbrush, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Panic fueled his every movement. His boots slipped over wet leaves, skidded across uneven roots, but he kept running, his body driven by a primal fear. He would never have dreamed that hunting could put him in this situation. He saw the wolf and shot at it, thinking that, although illegal, he could either get a hefty sum for the pelt or a nice coat. But not only the animal withstood 1, 2, 3 shots, but the beast started to hunt him in turn, and no amount of bullets would put it down. Behind him there was a howl, almost human but twisted, feral. The man had heard stories of these woods, whispers of strange things lurking in the night, but he never believed any of it until he saw the creature himself. It had been stalking him, keeping to the shadows, appearing only briefly with the glimpse of a shape between the trees. But something caught the man's attention and he noticed it. Half human, half beast, moving on all fours with terrifying fluidity, its limbs contorting as though the bones inside were constantly shifting. The man's mind raced, trying to recall the fragments of information he'd heard about the creature. But nothing would come. All he knew was that he had to keep running. His heartbeat thundered in his chest, a frantic rhythm that matched his footfalls. He glanced over his shoulder, the darkness swallowing everything beyond the reach of his straining eyes. The sound of pursuit was closer now, a low guttural growl rumbling from behind. He stumbled into a clearing, his legs burning, the cold air tearing through his lungs. There was no time to think, no time to catch his breath. His eyes darted around, seeking any way out. The trees loomed like towering sentinels, their branches weaving together overhead, blocking out the sky. The forest was an endless maze. He had no sense of direction, no escape plan, only the sheer animal instinct to survive. Another growl, closer this time. The man froze, his body instinctively shrinking back into the shadows. Slowly he turned his head. There, at the edge of the clearing, the creature emerged from the blackness. It stood upright now, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, hollow and predatory, looking for him. On 2 legs, the creature started to walk tentatively, passing behind a tree, but on the other side came an owl taking flight. The animal perched itself on the top of a tree. Its head frantically looked in all directions until it locked eyes with its prey. The man's stomach twisted in horror. The owl's head tilted, almost curious, as if savoring the fear rolling off its prey. Without warning, it lunged, taking flight, its eyes gleaming red as it cut the air with its wings fully open. It landed behind a bush, But from there came out a grotesque wolf, the fur black like coal and ashes and unnaturally sharp teeth. Its limbs were long and slender, and in its front legs a mix of paw and hand that scraped the bark of the nearest tree. The man bolted. Adrenaline surged through his veins, fueling a burst of speed he didn't know he had. He could hear it behind him, the snapping of branches and the low snarl growing louder with every heartbeat. His body screamed in protest, his legs on the verge of collapse, but the terror kept him moving. The forest became a blur, a tangle of shapes and shadows. The man's breath came in short, desperate gasps, each step a battle against the exhaustion creeping into his limbs. He could feel the creature's presence, its weight on the air, almost close enough to touch. Then silence. The man dared a glance behind him, his heart thudding in his throat. Nothing. The woods were still, the only sound the distant hum of the city and the soft rustling of leaves. The creature had vanished, as if it had never been there. For a brief moment, hope flickered in the man's chest. Had he outrun it? But something was wrong. The air had changed, thicker, colder. He turned back, and his blood ran cold. A mountain lion slowly made its way to him, too close for him to run. He stood in place, frozen, his body trying to create distance but finding resistance from a tree behind as the animal smelled him and licked its own mouth. Nothing, though, could have prepared him for what came next. There, in front of him, the animal started to change. Its bones cracked and shifted, its skin shredded and bled. In place of the mountain lion, there it stood, the skinwalker. It was no longer a beast, no longer a creature of shifting flesh. The thing that stood before him was human, or at least it appeared to be. A man, tall and thin, dressed in dark, tattered clothing. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes, those hollow, gleaming eyes, were unmistakable. The skinwalker smiled, revealing a mouthful of sharp, gleaming teeth. But there was no joy in it, only hunger. In that moment, the truth crashed over the man like a wave of ice. It had toyed with him, luring him into a game of fear and survival. The man's legs gave out beneath him. He fell to his knees, his strength gone, his body trembling as the vampire approached. The creature moved with a grace that was almost beautiful, its every step calculated, precise. There would be no escape. As the vampire's hand reached out, the man closed his eyes, his final thoughts drowned in a wave of dread. The last thing he heard was the soft rustle of leaves, the whisper of death drawing near. The forest swallowed him whole. In the distance, the city of Dreadford continued to pulse, unaware of the darkness lurking just beyond its borders, in the ancient woods where the old predators still hunted. Diego El Tormenta Rocha was at the height of his wrestling career. Every fight he entered, he crushed his opponents, leaving behind a trail of broken champions. His rise had been meteoric, thanks to his slick-talking manager, Bruno Costa. With his victories came fame, fortune, and even a glamorous girlfriend. Diego was living the dream until one day, Bruno approached him with an intriguing offer, an underground tournament. Bruno slid an embossed envelope across the table in Diego's penthouse apartment. It was invite only. The Warriors Spirit Academy was putting it on, and Bruno had been working to get his client in. The wrestler raised an eyebrow as he took the invitation. The prize was unimaginable, a fortune beyond anything he'd ever seen, sponsorships with global reach, and promises of power that were almost too good to believe. But something about it was off. There was an undercurrent of secrecy, something that made even Diego's stomach churn with unease. Diego questioned if he really needed this. After all, he was already on top. Bruno flashed his usual salesman grin, explaining that this is the next level. Everyone hears about these guys, but nobody can find them unless they want you. Only the best fight at the Warrior's Spirit. Despite his reservations, Diego couldn't resist the allure. His competitive fire, always burning bright, told him this was a test of true greatness, and he couldn't say no to a challenge. The tournament was unlike anything Diego had ever seen. Held in a remote facility in the mountains, the Warriors' Spirit Academy exuded an ancient, almost mystical atmosphere. Fighters, each more imposing than the last, arrived in sleek, black cars and disappeared behind the Academy's massive doors. The first round started easily enough. Diego's strength and agility outmatched his opponent. But as the tournament progressed, something felt off. His adversaries grew more dangerous, almost inhuman. They were impossibly strong, moving faster than any fighter Diego had faced before. It was as if they were tapping into some hidden reserve of power, something beyond what human bodies should be capable of. Diego pushed himself to his absolute limits. He embraced the pain, the exhaustion, using it as fuel. One by one, he defeated the other fighters, edging ever closer to the tournament's final stages. By the time he reached the semi-finals, his body was wrecked, bruises, cuts, and the wear of relentless combat weighing him down. But it wasn't enough. The semi-final match was a war, a brutal back and forth against a hulking, silent opponent whose blows felt like sledgehammers. For the first time in years, Diego felt fear. Fear that his strength wasn't enough. His body broke before his will, and in a blinding moment of pain, his world went black. When Diego awoke, he was somewhere dark, cold, and the pain in his body had reached a nightmarish new level. He tried to move but felt resistance. Something was holding him in place. Gasping, he realized the truth. He was hanging from the ceiling, chains digging into his flesh, metal hooks piercing his skin, keeping him suspended. Before he could scream, a voice echoed through the darkness, smooth, yet dripping with malice.
You impressed me, Diego.
A tall figure stepped forward, with eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. His presence was unnatural, predatory. Diego didn't understand what was going on. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry, his muscles screaming in agony. The creature smiled, revealing unnervingly sharp teeth.
This is your final test. You fought well in the tournament, better than most. But you lost, and now you've been brought here for judgment.
Diego's mind raced, trying to comprehend the horror of his situation, and the figure supernaturally understood. It moved closer, his eyes locking onto Diego's.
I can be your undoing or your savior. You caught my interest, Diego, and I am here to extend you an offer, a choice. Remain here, hanging like cattle until you bleed out, or pull those hooks from your flesh and survive.
Diego's vision blurred, but he forced himself to focus. His body was torn apart, but his will remained unbroken. With a growl of defiance, he reached for the hooks, each movement a fresh wave of torment. Blood poured down his body as he yanked one hook out, then another, each one tearing more of his skin. The pain was unbearable, but Diego refused to give up. He'd always been a fighter. With the last hook removed, Diego collapsed to the ground, panting, drenched in sweat and blood. The vampire watched, his smile widening.
Good, very good.
The creature knelt beside Diego, lifting him by the chin.
You have earned your place among us. You have the spirit of a warrior, and I will make you stronger than you ever dreamed.
Diego's vision darkened as the vampire's cold hands gripped his neck. He felt the sharp sting of fangs sinking into his flesh, draining him of life, yet at the same time, awakening something else, something ancient, something powerful. The last thing he heard before everything went black was the vampire's chilling whisper.
Welcome to the warrior spirit.
Farah moved through the crowded subway station, the thick scent of human life pressing in around her. She kept her presence supernaturally muted, just another dark figure among the churning masses, her vampiric gift cast over her like a shroud, keeping her invisible to mortal eyes. A sleek rumble echoed through the underground subway station as Farah traced the movement of her target. The man, broad-shouldered, draped in dark layers that concealed his unnatural aura, glided down the platform, looking more shadow than flesh. An echo from the ancient empire drifted from him, his gaze sharp, the bones of the dead woven into his clothing in ominous designs. They called him Tarsian, a name that spoke of death and ancient magic, a bone whisperer among mortals, a scion of spells muttered from Rome's blood-soaked past. The subway roared in, scattering people with the sharp hissing of its brakes. As the doors slid open, Farah moved silently, slipping into the same car as Tarsian. Her grip tightened on her knives, their edges gleaming with her venomous blood. As if sensing her gaze, he turned and gave her a crooked smile, his lips parting in a whisper only she could hear.
Here, you would bring this game to a crowd of mortals. You're late, Inquisitor.
They won't notice a thing.
She answered as she projected her shroud over him, to ensure both of their presences would remain hidden. Tarsian chuckled, moving his hand with a subtle, dismissive wave, and she felt a faint shift as if the air around him was alive. Passengers moved in and out, mindless of the danger cloaked in shadows around them. The car jolted forward and the train lurched into motion.
I've met ghosts less quiet than you, Spider.
He mocked. But Farah didn't give him time to react further. She swept forward, knives flashing, the scent of venom filling the air around them. In a silent arc, she brought a blade toward his back, only to feel her knife clash against bone. Dark energies rippled from Tarsian as he turned, murmuring a spell under his breath. The bones embedded in his cloak shivered, twisted, and clattered to the floor, reshaping into jagged skeletal figures. They lunged at her with broken arms and fingers like talons. Farah slipped past them, deflecting a bony strike with one knife as she drew another, dipping it in her own blood to renew its venomous edge. Her shroud flickered but held. Passengers remained unaware, heads buried in newspapers and music. The first skeleton sprang forward, its jaws open in a silent scream. Farah sidestepped, driving her knife into the jaw. The venom seeped through, turning the bone black as it disintegrated. Tarsian's grin faltered, his eyes narrowing as Farah sliced through another skeleton with supernatural speed, her blades flashing in the dim light.
You think you can match centuries of bonecraft with a few poison knives?
Tarsian sneered, raising his hands. With a flick of his wrist, he sent a bony spear hurtling towards her. Farah twisted, deflecting it with telekinetic force, her eyes glinting with dark amusement.
You're not leaving here, Tarsian. You'll answer to the tower, one way or another.
She taunted, her voice low and deadly. Passengers shifted around them, oblivious, while Farah danced through the barrage of bones, her venom slicing through the undead soldiers as fast as they formed. One stray skeleton lurched too close to a young man at the back of the car, and Farah struck out with an arc of telekinetic energy, smashing the bones to dust before they could touch him. Tarsian's gaze turned desperate as they neared the next station. He made a break for the door. With a sudden blur of movement, she used her telekinesis to fling herself forward, dodging through oblivious passengers and catching up to him just as the train slid to a stop and the doors opened. They stepped into the station, a crowded platform with people hustling in all directions. As the passengers flowed around them,
Going somewhere?
she murmured, her knife leveled at his throat, venom glistening on its edge. His sneer twisted into a grudging smirk.
One day, Inquisitor, the tower will see you as expendable.
She leaned in, her voice almost a hiss.
Until then, I'll be waiting for the next poor soul who dares cross us.
She tightened her grip, and with a final chilling smile led him off the platform. The waters of Lake Dreadford were still, their surface a mirror of the darkening sky. The fading light of dusk cast long shadows over the surrounding trees, and the last remnants of mist clung stubbornly to the edges of the shore. A lone fisherman sat at the edge of the old dock, the creak of wood beneath him the only sound in the quiet expanse. His line cut through the glassy surface, casting ripples that seemed to dissolve into the depths. He had been fishing here for years. The lake was old, like everything in Dreadford, a relic of the land before the city had grown into the sprawling, corrupt metropolis it was now. To him, the lake was a sanctuary, a place where he could escape the noise and decay of the world. But the quiet tonight felt different. Something was wrong. He couldn't say why, but an unease settled over him as the last rays of sunlight slipped behind the distant hills. The air seemed heavier, the sky darker than it should have been. The water, usually so calm and welcoming, felt watchful, like it held something deep beneath its surface. Something waiting. His rod jerked. The man's breath hitched in his throat as he grabbed it with both hands, his heart skipping. The line pulled taut, vibrating with tension. He had hooked something big. He grinned, the anticipation pushing away the strange sense of dread that had been building all evening. With a firm grip, he started to reel it in, muscles straining against the weight on the other end. But as he pulled, the line tugged back, harder than it should have. It wasn't a fish. The resistance wasn't natural. It felt alive, but not in the way he was used to. His stomach churned, a cold sweat forming on the back of his neck. He tried to let go, but it was too late. The thing beneath the surface had taken hold. The lake erupted. From the dark water came a monstrous shape, towering above the dock. The fisherman was thrown backward as the creature breached the surface, his rod ripped from his grasp. His mind could barely process what he was seeing, a grotesque, hulking form that rose from the lake like a nightmare given flesh. It was covered in slick, mottled scales, its skin a sickly green that shimmered in the dim light. Its head was a grotesque mix of fish and man, with massive, unblinking eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. He had heard the old tales, the superstitions about Lake Dreadford, but he had never believed them. Not until now. The creature roared, a sound that made him tremble. He scrambled to his feet, panic gripping him as he turned to run, but there was no escape. One of the creature's arms lashed out, wrapping a hand around his leg with terrifying speed. The fisherman screamed as it dragged him toward the edge of the dock, toward the freezing, murky depths. The water swirled black as ink. His vision blurred with terror as he clawed at the wooden planks, trying to anchor himself, but the creature's grip was too strong. He felt the cold of the lake water seeping into his bones as he was pulled closer to the edge. Just as he was about to be consumed by the abyss, there was a flash of movement from the trees. A blur of fur and motion leapt from the shoreline, slamming into the dock with the force of a cannonball. The impact sent splinters flying, and for a moment, the fisherman's world was nothing but chaos and noise. He could barely see what had attacked, but it wasn't human. Not entirely. The creature was bipedal, standing tall on its hind legs like a man, but its body was sleek, covered in dark fur, its eyes shining with intelligence. An otter, but larger, far larger than any otter had a right to be. The fisherman recognized it immediately from the stories of the Kushtaka, the legendary otter man, a protector of the waters, said to save those in danger from drowning or worse. The Kushtaka let out a guttural snarl, its eyes locking onto the monstrous form of the Dagon. With surprising speed and agility, it dove into the fray, its claws slashing through the air. The hand holding the fisherman loosened, the creature's focus shifting to its new opponent. The fisherman tumbled backward, scrambling away from the water as the battle unfolded before him. The Dagon roared again, its eyes burning with rage, and the lake itself seemed to respond. Waves surged, crashing against the shore as the monster lashed out at the Kushtaka. But the Ottoman was swift, darting between the creature's attacks, its movements fluid like the water itself. The Kushtaka sank its teeth into one of the Dagon's arms, tearing through the thick, slimy flesh. Black ichor spilled into the water, hissing as it hit the surface. The monster howled in fury, retreating momentarily, but the Kushtaka did not let up. It was relentless, biting, clawing, driving the beast back toward the depths of the lake. For a moment it seemed as though the Kushtaka would prevail, but the Dagon, enraged, surged forward with terrifying strength, one massive arm crashing into the dock. The wood splintered beneath the impact, and the fisherman cried out as he was thrown backward into the shallows. The Kushtaka, undeterred, let out a final, ferocious snarl before diving beneath the water. The two creatures disappeared into the lake's depths, the surface bubbling violently before growing still once more. The fisherman lay in the shallows, gasping for breath, his body trembling with shock. He stared at the water, half expecting the beast to rise again, to finish what it had started. But the lake remained quiet, its surface undisturbed except for the ripples spreading from the broken dock. Slowly, painfully, the fisherman pulled himself to his feet. He staggered back toward the shore, his mind reeling from the horror he had just witnessed. He glanced once more at the lake, where the faintest hint of mist was beginning to gather again. He had been saved. As the fisherman limped away from the lake, the dark waters remained still. The air in his office was thick with dust, the dim light from the ancient lamp casting long shadows on the stacks of papers and books that cluttered every surface. Professor Samuel Stone sat at his desk, staring at the cryptic tome he had uncovered earlier that week in the basement of the university's library. It was an old thing, its leather cover cracked and worn, the title barely legible, Veritas Abyssi. He had found it tucked away behind other forgotten relics, its pages filled with symbols and strange glyphs he couldn't fully understand. Yet there was something about it that tugged at him. He had spent nights poring over its words, trying to decipher the strange passages. At first it was nothing more than an intellectual curiosity, but soon it became an obsession. The more he read, the more his mind was consumed by it. The symbols seemed to pulse and shift on the pages as though they were alive. They wormed their way into his thoughts, even invading his dreams. And the dreams, they were the strangest part. They began innocuously at first. Samuel would find himself standing in endless halls of impossible architecture, darkened corridors that bent and twisted like the bones of ancient beasts. He walked these halls endlessly, guided by a shadowy figure whose features he could never quite make out. But as the nights wore on, the dreams became more vivid, more disturbing. He saw visions of the earth split open, of cities crumbling beneath the weight of enormous tentacles that reached from beneath the ground. He felt a presence lurking just beyond his sight, something vast, something ancient watching him. And then, the coincidences started. At first they were small, finding money he hadn't realized he had, papers being accepted to conferences he hadn't expected to attend. But then they grew more significant. His lectures became more captivating, his words drawing rapt attention from both students and colleagues alike. He was promoted to head of his department seemingly out of nowhere, his career rising faster than ever before. It was as if something was guiding his life, bending it in ways he couldn't understand. It should have made him feel triumphant, but instead he felt a growing dread. The night they came for him, the rain was pouring in torrents, rattling against his office window. He had been working late, once again drawn to Veritas Abyssi, when he heard the knock at his door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. He froze, his heart racing. It was late. Far too late for anyone to be here. Slowly he rose from his chair and approached the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the knob. When he opened it, there were 3 figures standing in the hallway, their faces obscured by the hoods of their long dark robes.
Professor Stone, we came for you.
The one in the center said, his voice low and rasping. Samuel stepped back, fear flooding his veins.
I don't know who you are. You shouldn't be here.
He stammered, his voice shaking, but the figure stepped forward, undeterred.
You've seen it, haven't you? The dreams, the signs. You've been chosen.
Chosen for what?
Samuel demanded, his mind spinning.
To serve him. Qui est pater abyssi nostri?
The figure intoned, his voice reverberating through the air like a distant thunderclap.
The dreams are no accident. You have been marked by Veritas Abyssi. You are the vessel through which our God shall return.
No, I don't want this. I'm not part of your cult.
He shouted, backing away from the door. The figures didn't move. The leader raised his hand, a long bony finger pointing directly at Samuel.
You cannot run from fate. The veiled prince has chosen you.
The professor slammed the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He stumbled back to his desk, grabbing the cursed book and shoving it into his bag. His breath came in ragged gasps as he made his way out of the building, ignoring the cold rain that lashed at him. He ran through the empty streets, trying to shake the feeling that they were watching him. that the shadows were moving, shifting in ways they shouldn't. The city itself seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as if something massive and hidden was stirring beneath its foundations. In the days that followed, Samuel tried to distance himself from the book, from the strange dreams, but it was futile. The dreams grew worse, and now they were joined by a hellish fever that sent him into delirium. He couldn't sleep without seeing that shadow figure, without feeling the pull of the abyss beneath his feet, as if he was being dragged into hell. He saw the cultists everywhere, watching him from across the street, lurking in doorways, their eyes gleaming with dark purpose. His mind was unraveling. Samuel's once ordered life had become chaos. He couldn't teach, couldn't work. His colleagues whispered about his erratic behavior, his disheveled appearance. No one could understand the burden he carried. The weight of it was crushing him. One night the dreams shifted. No longer was he a mere spectator to the destruction, the dark halls of the veiled prince. This time, the shadow figure in his dreams turned to face him. Its form was impossible, its presence suffocating, its colors beyond recognition. But as it glitched, moving closer, Samuel came to a dreadful realization. It was himself. And in that moment, he understood. He belonged to it now. Not now, he had always been a part of it, a part of something greater. The fear that had gripped him for so long began to fade, replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. The fever was gone. The book, the cult, the dreams, it was all leading him to this. His fate was not something he could escape. It was written in the fabric of reality itself. You cannot run from fate. The next morning, Samuel stood before the cult once more. His resolve hardened. The rain still fell in sheets, but this time he didn't feel the cold. The leader of the cult stepped forward, bowing his head slightly.
You have accepted the truth.
I am the chosen one, the vessel of our Lord, the veiled prince, the whispering abyss, the maw, our god, Nilathargoth Octa Nomen.
And as the cult surrounded him, their chants rising in unison, Samuel felt the presence of the veiled prince closing in, the abyss yawning wide to welcome him. He wasn't afraid anymore. He was delighted. In the heart of Dreadford, in a forgotten corner of an ancient building, lived Elara Rhodes, a reclusive artist whose works already carried whispers of the otherworldly. Her paintings were visceral, strange, and often deeply unsettling. She captured uncanny realms as if she had walked their paths herself. But this latest series of creations would surpass them all, pulling her down a path few could imagine. It began with dreams, sharp and vivid. Each night, Elara found herself in a sprawling temple, submerged beneath the roots of an ancient mountain. Monolithic stone pillars twisted in geometric impossibilities, stretching and folding as though bound by dimensions beyond human perception. The walls bore symbols in languages she'd never learned, glyphs that whispered as she passed. She felt an unnatural familiarity there, a sense of longing and dread. But each morning, as her memories slipped from dream to consciousness, the sense of foreboding did not fade. Instead, it burrowed deeper. She began to paint, feverishly, unable to control the movements of her own hands. Her once organized studio devolved into chaos. Sheets of canvas layered the floor, and paint cans overturned, leaving trails of dark, viscous colors that streaked across the room like veins. She painted for hours, days, weeks without end, a haunting replica of the temple taking form on her canvases. Her friends and patrons grew concerned. Elara was once a social recluse, yes, but not like this. She rarely ate, barely slept, muttering to herself as she layered brushstroke upon brushstroke with a violent, obsessive rhythm. She had abandoned her usual style and instead conjured landscapes and architectures that felt alive. Shadows stretching across impossible plains, vast doorways yawning into the darkness, and towering figures cloaked in mist. One day she found herself holding an ivory key, not remembering where it had come from or when she had picked it up. It was carved with the same symbols as in her dreams, intricate marks that seemed to shift under the light. She held it, entranced, feeling an electric pull as though it were calling to something inside her. That night her dreams grew darker. She felt herself in the presence of titanic beings, formless yet horrific, composed of shadows and stars. Their voices echoed in an ancient tongue, vibrating through her very bones, whispering secrets about time and space, revealing to her glimpses of alternate worlds and doorways between realities. Days later, her hands trembled as she painted what could only be described as a portal, a whirling, chaotic maw of darkness flanked by impossible geometries. The colors and lines pulsed on the canvas, so vibrant they seemed ready to consume the room around her. Her brushstrokes seemed dictated by an unseen force, driving her deeper and deeper into madness. She became convinced the portal was no mere creation but a gateway, a passage to something lying just beyond, waiting to cross over. One night, she found herself standing on the cold shore of Dreadford's beach, barefoot, the stars above stark and cruel against the midnight sky. The wind whispered in her ear, ancient voices threading together, binding her in their chant. The sounds were incomprehensible but strangely familiar, and she knew with a sick certainty that her transformation was nearing completion. By the next morning, she was no longer Elara Rhodes, not truly. The compulsion within her had overpowered all vestiges of her former self, stripping away her thoughts, her fears, even her will. She painted without end, the temple now bleeding off the canvas and onto the walls, the floors and the windows of her studio. Her work no longer needed canvases. Her hands painted of their own accord, her eyes vacant, glazed with dark ecstasy. The day they found her was marked in her journal as the Convergence. She had scrawled a single sentence over and over, filling the last pages with the same words, sinking deeper into madness with each line. I am but the brush, the abyss, the artist. After Elara was confined to Dreadford Asylum, her paintings, over 100 canvases of distorted vistas, cryptic temples, and terrifying figures, went up for auction. Only one buyer showed any interest. Professor Samuel Stone, a collector with an eccentric reputation, made an offer for the entire collection. He came to the auction himself, his eyes gleaming with something dark and knowing as he surveyed the work, his face set with eerie calm. His presence commanded the space, and no one dared question his motives as he methodically inspected each painting, touching the canvases with reverence. To the professor, these works weren't just art, they were conduits, tools meant to awaken the abyssal forces, sleeping beyond human comprehension. Months later, he walked through a sprawling estate on the outskirts of town, arranging the paintings with a discerning eye. The walls of the room filled with Elara's work, each image placed precisely, like pieces of a larger, sinister puzzle. The effect was overpowering, an oppressive atmosphere cloaking the room. In the center of the room was a crib, covered in fine lace, awaiting the arrival of a small, unknowing child. This child was no ordinary baby, but a carefully chosen vessel, born to bring the cult's vision to life, a living conduit for the dark gods who Elara had unwittingly channeled. Stone walked around the crib, whispering words in a forgotten language, his voice like a droning prayer to an unseen presence. He would make certain that she grew up surrounded by Elara's creations. She would absorb the knowledge held within the paintings, the temple, the portal, the dark gods hidden beyond human understanding. This room would be her world, and these gods her silent mentors. As he lit a candle, Stone stepped back, his gaze fixated on the crib. A smirk tugged at his lips as he murmured to himself, his voice a low, reverent hum.
Welcome, little one. The abyss awaits its daughter.
Marianne Rodriguez had always been a curious woman, always reading between the lines, looking for patterns where others saw none. Over the years, her fascination with the unknown had morphed into a deep obsession with conspiracy theories. It started small, secret societies, government cover-ups, but then it grew, spiraling into something far darker. It was during one of her late-night listening sessions, scanning through the static-filled frequencies of her old radio, that she first noticed it, a faint rhythmic pulsing like a heartbeat buried beneath the music. At first, she dismissed it as interference, but it always appeared at the same moment, right when a song from Vanilla, the new pop sensation, started to play. Vanilla was the latest idol to sweep the nation. She was young, beautiful, and adored by millions of fans, especially teenagers and young adults. Her songs were catchy, almost hypnotic, with lyrics that seemed to stick in your head long after the music stopped. But for Marianne, there was something wrong with Vanilla's music, something sinister. It took months of listening, rewinding tapes, and obsessing over every beat, but Marianne finally pieced it together. The songs were laced with subliminal messages, inaudible whispers beneath the surface. She couldn't quite make out the words, but she felt them, commands, suggestions, steering the listener's thoughts and desires. And Vanilla's music wasn't just playing on the radio, it was everywhere on TV, in commercials, in stores. It was inescapable. Marianne tried to tell her family. She called her daughter Anne and her son David, explaining her discovery in frantic, desperate phone calls. But they didn't believe her. They thought she was spiraling into another one of her conspiracy theories, this time fueled by paranoia and old age. Anne begged her to stop, telling her that the stress wasn't good for her. David stopped answering her calls altogether. They were worried, not about Vanilla, but about Marianne. Undeterred, Marianne dove deeper. She collected recordings of Vanilla's songs, playing them over and over, scribbling down notes and diagrams in her cluttered living room. The pulsing, the whispers, they were all there, clear as day to her, yet invisible to everyone else. She reached out to others in the conspiracy theory community, but they too thought she'd gone too far. Then, one night, she heard something terrifying. The pulsing in Vanilla's newest song grew louder, more insistent. Marianne swore she could finally understand the words beneath the music. They weren't just random whispers, they were commands.
Follow, obey, worship.
Marianne's hands shook as she realized the horrifying truth. The music was brainwashing people, controlling them without their knowledge. The young were being molded into mindless followers. She tried to call Anne again, but this time Anne didn't even pick up. A few days later, Marianne's family arrived at her doorstep. Anne looked somber, while David seemed frustrated. They gently told her they were worried about her, that she needed help. Marianne pleaded with them, showing them her notes, her tapes, but they wouldn't listen.
You're not well, Mom. You need to rest.
Marianne's protest fell on deaf ears as they led her out of the house. They brought her to a quiet facility, a place where they said she could get the help she needed. The sterile white walls of the asylum felt suffocating. No radio, no connection to the outside world. Her theories, her warnings, they were all dismissed as the ramblings of a madwoman. But Marianne knew she wasn't crazy. Days turned into weeks, and Marianne's isolation deepened. The nurses were polite but distant. Her family stopped visiting. And yet, even in the silence of her new home, she couldn't stop thinking about the music. It was everywhere now, on the radio, in the halls of the asylum, echoing faintly from the televisions in the common rooms. Vanilla's face was plastered on every screen, her voice in every speaker. Then one day, as Marianne sat by the window of her room, she saw them. Anne and David, walking through the garden with their children. They looked happy, content. But something was wrong. As they approached the table to sit down with her for a visit, their eyes seemed empty, glazed over.
Are you ready, Mom?
What do you mean, Anne?
To follow, obey, and worship.
Marianne's heart sank as the realization hit her like a punch to the gut, as they started to hum one of Vanilla's songs under their breath, moving in perfect sync with the beat. Her children, her grandchildren, they were already gone. The music had taken them. No one believed her. No one cared. The truth had been staring them in the face, and now it was too late. The world outside had fallen under Vanilla's spell, one song at a time. As the faint echoes of Vanilla's latest hit played through the asylum, as Marianne screamed in daft madness trying to reach for her family, The men and women in white grabbed her, sedating her. As the world around began to blur and dark, she realized the truth. She was the last person who knew, and soon she would be silenced and forgotten. The moon was full and high up in the sky when Josh came out of the tent with his bottle of scotch. He had been hiking all day at Skinwalker Peak, and now he could finally rest. He looked at the view, and far away he saw the sparkling lights of Dreadford in the distance. The sound of crickets filled the mountain, and he felt at home. He reached in his jacket and took out a pack of cigarettes and lit one up, sitting in a camping chair. The cold air filled his nostrils, and the mix of alcohol and tobacco made him more relaxed. Monday, he would have to go back to his minimum wage job as a barista, but tonight, he was a free man. He thought about Carla. She was a client at his coffee place, and they have been flirting for a while, and yesterday by chance he bumped into her outside his work. He built up his nerve and asked her out, and she accepted. They would go to the movies and see where the night would go from there. The thought of the date made him smile, but he never noticed. Suddenly, the place became very quiet, and a chill ran up his spine. He looked one way and another, and in the bushes, drowned in shadows right where the camplight could not reach, he saw what seemed to be a figure looking at him. He got up and took a step forward, but there was nothing. He asked if someone was there but heard no answer. He stood in place for a while until he convinced himself it was his mind playing tricks. He took another sip of whiskey and lit up another cigarette. When he lifted his head, he saw again, right in front of him, standing still in the darkness. He could feel the eyes of the figure on him. He asked whoever it was to make itself known, but the figure gave a step behind the trees and vanished. Josh thought he was seeing things. He looked at the glass of whiskey and threw the remainder of the glass on the floor. He walked around camp for a while, but did not find anyone. He checked his .38 just to make sure, but decided it was his mind playing tricks. Skinwalker Peak was known for eerie and bizarre occurrences. Glowing orbs, Bigfoot, skinwalkers, feral people were part of the mythology of these mountains, but Josh never took it seriously. Finally, he gave up and went to his tent to try to get some sleep. The next day, he packed all his gear and continued his hike. As he went through the trail, the hair on his neck raised and a feeling of dread and impending doom started to flood his mind. He stopped and checked his surroundings, but even though no animal or person was visible, he could not shake the feeling off. He continued his path, trying to be as much aware as he could, but that feeling never left. He stopped to rest for a bit, drink water and eat. As he was munching on a protein bar, he heard the snap of a twig outside the trail. He looked around, and he could swear he was seeing a dark figure between branches some 30 feet from him. He brushed his eyes and looked again, but no one was there, and the hair on his arm raised. He tried once again to brush it off, made camp, but decided this night he would spend it inside his tent. He checked his map, calculated how far he was from his destination, and went to sleep. He was awoken by steps on his camp. Crippling fear took hold of him, and he stood still under his covers. The steps continued and stopped right next to his tent, and whoever it was stood there gazing upon it for a while. He trembled, and it was with great effort that he held his breath, and when he could not hold it any longer, he tried as quiet as possible to breathe by his mouth. Finally, whoever it was went away. He stood there for a bit, and then came out terrified. He looked at the ground, and there were no footprints nor anyone. He felt he was spiraling. Was he going mad? Seeing things? He went back to his tent and tried to make himself sleep, but could not. When it was almost morning, he felt the smell of cigar invading his tent. That was it. He broke camp and returned to the trail. He was still one night away from his destination and decided to leave earlier. He spent another day feeling that he was being watched. Many times he thought he was seeing a figure outside the trail, but he had enough. He decided to ignore it and just finish the trail as quickly as he could, but now he was carrying his .38 by the waist in any case. The final night was here. Josh did not make fire this time. He didn't want his camp to be visible from afar, and he wanted to break camp as fast as he could the next day. He went to bed early and spent his time inside at all times. The feeling of being watched went away, and he finally fell asleep. At the witch's hour, he was awakened by what he thought was a bear sniffing around his camp. Although the size was right, the shadows projected in the sides of the tent revealed more wolf-like features on the creature's head. Josh was puzzled and frightened at the same time. He reached for his .38 and cocked it. The creature heard and stopped immediately what it was doing, and in an immense display of cunning, slowly walked away from camp. But when Josh could finally rest again, he heard it. A howl cut the silence of the night. Horrified, he started to gather his things as quickly as possible. He was breaking camp when he heard snarls and paws trampling the dirt. He collected only the necessary things, leaving his tent and his boots behind, and started to run downhill bare feet as fast as he could. The only thing he carried was his .38. He heard barking and ran even faster, but stumbled, rolling down. His head was grazed and he stood up looking behind. He saw a mountain of fur and muscles coming after him, snarling. He took his gun and shot the creature 3 times. The animal was deterred enough for him to start to run again as fast as he could. He fled in darkness, barely seeing what was in front of him as the beast was constantly nearing. He could feel a warm breath in his neck. He screamed and ran, his legs burning beneath his weight. The beast was ever so close, but never catching him. He looked behind and saw the jaws of the animal reaching for his flesh. He jumped, barely escaping. When he landed, one of his feet stepped wrong and he fell. It was broken. He cried in pain, wincing. He shot everything that remained in the gun, but nothing could deter the beast this time. His vision was blurry and fading because of the pain and desperation, but when he could see again, there was only the red gleaming eyes of the creature before his jaw opened and bit him, and everything went dark. The next day, he was woken up by 2 hikers who found him. The sun shone brightly in his eyes, obfuscating his vision. He felt his skin covered in sweat and some blood, but his foot was healed. Did he hallucinate everything? The hikers told him not to worry. They had sent word to the park rangers. He was tired and still scared, but felt safe and allowed himself to collapse. It began with an enigmatic poster appearing overnight, nailed to lampposts and plastered on every street corner. The image was hauntingly beautiful, a crimson tent draped in shadows with silvered edges that seemed to glint under the moonlight. It promised an experience like no other, the eternal reverie circus where dreams and nightmares collide. By dusk, the atmosphere in the neighborhood was electric with curiosity and unease. People whispered about the mysterious arrival of the circus, each of their conversations marked by an inexplicable shiver of apprehension. The tent, erected on the outskirts of town, was an imposing structure with dark red and black stripes. Its entrance, a black void fringed with golden tassels that fluttered in the night breeze. Jonathan and Natalie entered the premises of the circus together with the other patrons. They saw a man spitting fire, a strong man, and jugglers, until finally they reached the entrance of the main tent, and adjacent to it there was a haunted house show. Jonathan invited Natalie to join him in the haunted house, but she wanted to see the exhibitions in the main tent. She was too scared of horror shows, so he told her to save him a seat and he would join her as soon as he was done, and they went their separate ways. Natalie entered the main tent that revealed a world that defied explanation. The interior was a vast, cavernous space, illuminated by eerie, flickering lights. Spectators stepped in, drawn by a compulsion they couldn't quite explain. Once inside, the air was thick with a heady perfume that weaved around their senses. The music was a haunting melody played on instruments that surely belonged to another era. Jonathan walked inside the haunted house. Animatronics of ghosts and recorded ghost moans played inside. Fake spider webs decorated the place. He made a turn and saw a cage with a sign that read, "The Unfathomable Wolfman." And inside there was a man in the best wolfman makeup he had ever seen. It was too real. The creature walked from side to side, growling with snarling teeth under a pair of crimson, luminous eyes. Inside the tent, Natalie couldn't believe her eyes. The performers were unlike anything she had seen before, acrobats with skin that shimmered like opals, with graceful yet disjointed movements as if time itself bent around them. Clowns with painted faces that seemed to move independently of their expressions, their laughter echoing unsettlingly in the space all around the audience. The animals, if they could be called that, were hybrids of beast and myth. Their eyes gleamed with an intelligence that sent shivers down the spines of anyone who glanced at them. Jonathan made another turn into a T-shaped corridor, and from the opposite side of him, the door banged open and a man wearing jeans overalls and a mask came out raging with a chainsaw that roared in the air, screeching against the metal wall as it spilled numerous sparks in the air in a terrorizing display of madness. Jonathan felt real fear and ran into the long corridor adjacent to the one he was in, and at the end he found a red door that he banged close as soon as he crossed it. In the main tent, as the show progressed, the audience was vibrant with excitement as though they were under a spell. The climax of the performance was celebrated with applause from the roaring crowd. The ringmaster, clad in an elaborate costume of crimson and gold, stepped into the center of the ring. His eyes were pools of deep black, reflecting a cruel delight. With a dramatic flourish, he announced the grand finale, a dance of shadows. In the haunted house, Jonathan was walking over a rope bridge that crossed the top of a pool of murky green water. He could not see what was inside of it, but spiky fins protruded above water, drawing a circle in the ghastly pool. Only the sounds of his heart still beating hard from the last room, and the drippings of water could be heard. As he crossed, a burst of water revealed an animatronic of a crocodile covered in weeds, with crimson eyes blinking. His heart almost came out of his mouth as he ran over the rope bridge. When he reached the end, at the side there was another cage with a sign that read, "Dagon, the monstrous creatures of the blood lagoon," and inside there was a creature that was a mixture of man and fish, covered in black scales, munching on a chicken inside of a pool. The creature growled as he watched Jonathan pass to the next room with a pair of bulbous black eyes and bristling gills. The main tent was plunged into darkness, save for a single spotlight that illuminated the ringmaster. A group of women took center stage, poi dancing and fire spinning to the rhythm of tribal drums. The shadows cast by the fire dancing seemed to come alive, stretching as though they were trying to escape from their own darkness. The audience watched, mesmerized, as the shadows began to creep closer, as the dancing reached its climax, their shapes forming into nightmarish figures that reached out with claw-like appendages. Jonathan finally reached a room marked by an exit sign pointing to a curve in the corridor. This was probably the most impressive haunted house he had ever visited, but he was glad it was coming to an end. He followed the curve and found himself in a room with a mirror, and behind it there was a door with the exit sign. The strange thing was that instead of reflecting Jonathan, the mirror reflected a clown with red hair, red jacket and boots. The clown was perfectly mimicking Jonathan's movements, as if he was its true reflection. Jonathan looked around, realizing he was alone, yet the clown continued to mimic his every move and expression. In the main tent, the public stood in awe by the mesmerizing effects of the dancing. Gasps erupted as the audience grew ever more enchanted by the performance. The shadows, now fully formed entities, danced independent of the women. Their whispers filled the air, promises of eternal delight, of a never-ending night. Jonathan approached the mirror and touched, his index finger connecting with the clown's. Suddenly, the clown winked at him, finally breaking character, and Jonathan took a step back, bumping into someone. As he turned, he saw the clown's red eyes luminous in the dark, and his mouth open with a pair of fangs salivating.
Peekaboo. I see you.
Were the last words Jonathan heard after he was bitten savagely in the neck, and everything went dark. In the midst of the chaos of the ending of the show, Natalie finally noticed something that made her skin crawl. Jonathan never showed up for the performance. As she looked everywhere for him, she felt a cold, suffocating sensation enveloping her. Her heart beat fast as the ever-growing sensation that something was horrifically wrong. Desperation drove Natalie to look everywhere for him, asking for any sign of him. In her frantic search, she ended up in the backstage of the circus, and there, inside a tent partially obscured by heavy drapes, she pushed through looking for her boyfriend, finding herself in a small room, barely illuminated by a single flickering candle. Natalie's breath came in ragged gasps as she adjusted her eyes to the dim light. Her heart pounded loudly in her chest, the shadows of the circus tent still in her thoughts. She began to make out the figures of two men standing in the far corner, their voices low and murmured, but clear enough to catch snippets of their conversation.
Well, I received your letter. The circus is in town for a damn good show.
Natalie's curiosity overcame her fear, and she edged closer, trying to listen without being noticed. The men spoke of something that sounded like a grand plan. The name Dreadford echoed ominously in her mind. As a resident of the city, she knew it had its share of dark legends, but she had never imagined anything like this. Natalie's pulse quickened. The men's words suggested that something sinister was about to unfold in her own city. She decided to take a risk. Moving as quietly as possible, Natalie reached for the door, but just as she was about to slip away, one of the men turned, catching a glimpse of her shadow.
Who's there?
He demanded, his tone sharp and accusatory. Natalie froze, her heart racing. She had been discovered. She turned slowly to face the men, her mind racing for an explanation or an escape. The two men exchanged a look, a mix of surprise and calculation.
Oh, it seems we have an uninvited guest.
Before Natalie could react, a clown with red hair, red jacket and boots reached out with a sudden, swift motion. His fingers brushed against Natalie's cheek, his touch cold and electrifying. She felt a sharp, searing pain as his fangs punctured her skin, a sensation both agonizing and strangely intoxicating. Her vision blurred as a wave of darkness overwhelmed her senses, and she slowly collapsed. The coin, tarnished and weathered but faintly glimmering in the dim light, sat in a dusty stall at the back of an occult market, nestled between cracked vials and candles. Its edges were rough, and though its details were eroded, there remained an impression of antiquity, as if it had traveled through countless hands over centuries. Above the coin, a small handwritten sign read, "Lucky coin, only $5, for fortunes beyond compare." The stall's owner, a hunched man with sunken eyes and a glint of something strange, watched as a middle-aged man approached, cautiously eyeing the various trinkets laid out before him. The customer's eyes settled on the coin, drawn to it by a pull that felt almost magnetic, and as he studied it, the owner leaned forward. The owner told him that the coin was no ordinary charm. It was a conduit for luck, a talisman that brings fortune to those who possess it. The man took the bait eagerly, the skepticism in his eyes fading as he studied the coin's allure. He'd been down on his luck lately, having lost his job and struggling with bills. What harm could a little luck charm do? He took out 5 crumpled dollars, placed them in the stall owner's outstretched hand, and left with the coin tucked tightly in his pocket, feeling a flicker of hope he hadn't felt in months. Over the next few days, however, things began to unravel. Small mishaps first, a stubbed toe here, a misplaced set of keys there. Then he lost his wallet in a taxi, his car broke down on his way to a promising interview, and an unexpected bill arrived, draining his last bit of savings. These annoyances would normally breed frustration, but instead, each one somehow filled him with a strange confidence. He felt certain that his luck would turn around at any moment. After all, he had the coin. The man clung to it with increasing desperation. "This is just a patch of bad luck," he assured himself. He rubbed the coin between his fingers as he walked, almost compulsively now, convinced that the coin's blessing just needed time to take effect. He ignored the mounting signs, the creeping sense of dread gnawing at the back of his mind, and instead focused solely on the notion that his fortune was bound to change. When he lost his apartment due to a missed rent payment, an oversight he swore was due to misplaced checks and mixed-up dates, he shrugged it off, chalking it up to coincidence. He clung tighter to the coin, determined to weather the storm. Luck can be tricky, he told himself as he found himself staying in a cheap motel, the one-night stand, surrounded by uncertainty. He placed the coin under his pillow each night, its weight pressing into his dreams, filling his sleep with whispered assurances of future success. He had lost everything, but at least he still had his lucky coin.
"Daniel!"
He grimaced, covering his head with the pillow, hoping whoever it was would give up and leave. But her voice continued, heartfelt and unyielding, drifting up from the parking lot.
You are a cool guy. You have helped a lot of people already in amazing ways. I have never met someone like you. We are going to find a solution somehow. Don't beat yourself too much.
The man groaned in exasperation. Now he couldn't even get some peace to sleep with ruffians making noise outside his door. It didn't matter. He caressed his lucky coin. At least he still had it. He was about to shout back, maybe even hurl his pillow against the door, when a sharp, ear-splitting roar filled the air. A sudden blast engulfed his room. In the blinding flash and deafening crash, his world erupted. His vision blurred, and he felt himself thrown backward as everything faded. His last thoughts dissolved into the explosion, a bitter fragment of his anger lingering in the smoke. The motel was reduced to rubble in an instant, a fiery blast echoing through the neighborhood, sending onlookers into a frenzy. Firefighters arrived swiftly, dousing the flames and scouring the wreckage for any signs of life. As they combed through the debris, one firefighter knelt beside a charred beam and noticed something odd glinting beneath the ash. A coin, weathered but miraculously intact. With a curious smile, he reached down and held it up, examining its strange, ancient design. The coin was warm from the blast, yet there was something about it that drew him in. With a wry grin crossing his face as he pocketed the coin, he said,
"This must be my lucky day."